All right, I think we can get started. I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. You all may wonder why the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research is interested in the far right. The YIVO Institute for Jewish Research was founded in 1925 in Poland. It has survived every plague of the 20th and now the 21st century. It is both a witness to the plagues of white ethno-nationalism, Judeophobia, Jidekomuna, and it is also the victim of these plagues. So I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening and braving this new plague that we have to deal with, which is as much a plague of fear and anxiety as it is a plague of actual little microbes or semi-microbes or whatever this thing is. But the plague of white ethno-nationalism is probably far worse. It has a long history, a deadly history. It was imported into this country in numerous ways. But just to put this in some perspective for you, when I did a lot of work in Russia in the 1990s and discovered in the gift shop of the Duma, the parliament, the Russian parliament, in the gift shop of the parliament building, a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, translated into Russian. There are multiple editions of this still available on the street in Moscow. Not in downtown Moscow any longer, but in the periphery. You can buy them easily enough. And it has a little preface to it by none other than Henry Ford. And you may ask, how is it possible that Henry Ford wrote a preface to the Russian edition of the Protocols of Elders of Zion? Well, it has to do with the fact that Henry Ford essentially imported that into America and is now considered an authority on the subject by the white nationalists of the extreme Russian right. That transformed itself out of the extreme Russian left when the Soviet Union collapsed. These are insidious ideas. They form a complex, a whole. They are deadly. They are precisely what an institution like the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research should study, should have public events about. We have 24 million documents in our archive, the largest archive in the world devoted to the subject of East European Jewish life. And in those archives that are in German, in Polish, in Russian, in Ukrainian, in Yiddish, in English, in French, in Romanian, in Hungarian, in Japanese, in Chinese, there is testimony to the insidious power of white ethno-nationalism, its devastating effects, not just on the Jews, but on humanity. One of the things that Alexander Yakovlev said before he died, Alexander Yakovlev was the architect of perestroika under Gorbachev. And one of the things that he said in opposition to these Russian fascists whom he hated was that as soon as anti-Semitism becomes a problem in the center of society. That is exactly when liberal democracy is being eaten away and crumbling and weakening. And so this is not a phenomenon of just isolated acts of violence. It's systemic, it's deep. And I'm delighted that Spencer Sunshine, who has organized this event, has put it together for us for this evening. Spencer, who will introduce the program, has been researching contemporary far-right and fascist movements for 15 years with special attention to anti-Semitism. Since 2016, his blow-by-blow coverage of the US far-right's meteoric rise to power has appeared in publications like Truth Out and Color Lines. The subject of several conspiracy theories himself, Sunshine is currently finishing a report on the origins of the neo-Nazi murder manual Siege, in addition to working on 2 books about Nazism in the United States. Spencer?
Thank you all for coming. I wasn't sure who was going to come out this evening. So, according to the Anti-Defamation League, the far right has killed over 360 people in the United States since Obama's election in 2008. Of these, well over 100 have occurred during Trump's time in office. These include the murders that happened at Charlottesville, the massacre in El Paso, and attacks at synagogues in Pittsburgh and Poway, California. 2 of the murders happened in New York City. In 2017, a white supremacist traveled from Baltimore intent on committing a killing spree because he was angry that black men were having relationships with white women. Almost 3 years ago, on March 20th, he murdered Timothy Kaufman in Times Square. 2 years after that, in March 2019, a follower of the QAnon conspiracy theory killed a mob boss in Staten Island. And these are just 2 of the 360 murders since 2008. The interesting thing is when you look closely at the data, the far right actually kills a broad spectrum of people. For example, in 2019, 38 murders were committed by the far right. According to these, when you break them down, 25 of them were politically motivated, including 22 people who died at the El Paso massacre in the Walmart. 2 of them were murders of other far-right members, and 11 of them were non-ideological, of which 5 of these were murders of the perpetrator's family members. So Chip's going to talk a little more specifically about the specific dynamic that drives many of the politically motivated attacks, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the bigger picture. The political targets of the far right range in specificity, and they include Jews, people of color, and specifically sometimes they target either immigrants or religious groups like Sikhs and Muslims. They target interracial couples where one person is white. They target feminists and women who are seen as rejecting some kinds of men. They'll target the LGBTQ community. The homeless are often killed in initiation rites. There'll be shootouts with police and other law enforcement. They kill federal workers. They target those who directly oppose them, including anti-fascists. And they are known to attack politicians and activists, especially those who support immigration and civil rights. Some of these murders are the result of intentional strategies of terrorism and guerrilla warfare, and others are crimes of opportunity and impulse. But the far-right murders of all this large number, they happen for other reasons too. And the ADL says that in the last decade, the far-right has actually killed more people, or right-wing extremists is their category, have killed more people for non-ideologically motivated reasons than for political ones. And these killings include the killings of suspected informants and murders related to domestic violence, drugs, gangs, and traditional crime. The most heartbreaking of these is the frequent murders of family members, including parents, intimate partners, and children. And there's anecdotal evidence of a high suicide rate amongst the far right. So when someone gets involved in this movement, particularly the white supremacist movement, they become a threat, and the threat isn't just to historically oppressed people, it's to their own families, and they may even end up as murder victims themselves. Sorry, I know this is all a little grim, but what does this mean to us? So the first thing is, the far right can't be considered an ordinary political movement. There's a large number of very loud pundits, and they're intent on equating the far right and the radical left. But when you look at the numbers, they just don't add up. So even according to the ADL, who are no friend of the radical left, they say that between 2007 and 2016, 98% of murders were committed by right-wing extremists or domestic Islamists. The second thing is, getting people out of the far right is very important. We want members of that movement to escape its toxic gravitational pull. And if they're sent to prison, rather than actually change their views will probably just get reinforced. They'll be considered heroes or martyrs in prison. People often go into prison not as racist and come out as white supremacists. It's very rare you hear that somebody goes into prison as a white supremacist and comes out as a non-racist. Last, because the far right targets so many different kinds of people, this actually provides us with a rare opportunity. Obviously, the Jewish community has a vested interest in fighting anti-Semitism wherever that occurs on the political spectrum. But when the Jewish community fights it specifically on the far right, it has a multiplier effect. This is because the Jewish community automatically ends up fighting for all the other groups that the far right targets as well, even if it doesn't intend to do that. For years, it's been popular to conceive of oneself as an ally to oppressed groups. And this can be a useful approach at times, but there's something important that gets lost in this. I believe that our political engagements shouldn't just be for other people. Ideally, they should be both for ourselves and for others. And because of this, I think we should prioritize engaging in those struggles in which we can do both of these things. So fighting the anti-Semitic far right presents the Jewish community with a rare opportunity. It can simultaneously act in a way that benefits our own interests and the interests of others. And so I encourage you to take this opportunity to support efforts to neutralize and contain the far right and to help its members leave the movement. The lives that we save might be our own, they might be those of other people who are targeted, and they might even be the lives of those who are caught up in this toxic political current. So, thank you. Abby, I forgot the bios. Can you bring them up? All right. Chip Berlet is an investigative journalist and an independent scholar who has studied far-right movements and conspiracy theories for over 40 years, including 3 decades as the senior analyst at the think tank Political Research Associates. Berlet is the co-author of Right-Wing Populism in America, Too Close for Comfort, and his new book is Trumping Democracy, From Reagan to the Alt-Right. He's also the co-author of the Neo-Nazism entry in the Encyclopedia Judaica and has written for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Progressive, and many other publications. So, and beforehand, before we let Chip speak, I want to have a little special presentation on behalf of both Abby and I and the other former members of Political Research Associates.
Cookies. Oh.
We would like to present him with the Lifetime Anti-Fascist Achievement Award for all of his work since the 1970s.
I just want to say that Chip has created a school. There's the Berletian scholars of the right. There are many of us who he has mentored over the years, written articles with us, helped us connect politics and our scholarship and understanding some of the ethical quandaries. So he has given birth to many people and in this sphere. So thank you, Chip, for everything.
Thank you. So that was charming, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. I have a telegraph key, which I'm going to hand down to this gentleman here, and it's going to be passed around as a little note, because what's really crucial in understanding is that mass genocide, not just genocide, but mass genocide in a mechanized way depended on mass communications. And the first example of that was the telegraph in the genocide of the Armenians, which allowed the Armenian army to send forces out to specific places. And it was the telegraph and the radio that allowed Hitler to do the same thing. And if we look at what's happening today, we're seeing these new mass communications systems being used, and society has not come up with a way of dealing with the power of them in mobilizing resentment, which was the name of a book by Jean Hardesty, who is my mentor. I'm very honored to speak here tonight. I have to put my ASA, disclaimer, American Sociological Association. I'm not a sociologist, but I play one on TV. I've published dozens of peer review and scholarly papers in sociology. I did not want to do this. I was dragged kicking and screaming into it by people who said, you know so much, you have to write stuff with citations. I was in the yippies, come on. So anyway, that's what I've done for about 30 years. I would say a more accurate term for this presentation tonight is Jew hatred and murder, but I assume the term anti-Semitism is understood by all of us here tonight. I have many colleagues in the audience tonight. I think it's important to look at the words we use to describe the phenomena. I have friends and allies who use the terms extremism and hate as the way to introduce people to the problem. I don't think those words are useful. I think we need to name the target and name the crime. So anti-Semitic murders or anti-Jewish murders or murders of Jews is a much better way than to talk about the extremism of the far right. There's no way that has the power of actually naming the target and naming the violation and crime. To understand the contemporary murderous far-right attack on Jews and others, we need to explore the relationships linking anti-Semitism and racism and male supremacy, fascism, neo-Nazism, but also something I call, and a lot of scholars call, apocalyptic violence. And apocalyptic violence is just the idea that time is running out, an important confrontation is about to occur, it will decide whether good or evil will prevail, and at the end of this struggle, the world will be changed. That's all the word apocalypticism means. I worked with a group at the Center for Millennial Studies at Boston University, and we talked about how this is such a powerful force throughout history. And there are many people who write about the history of anti-Semitism that talk about apocalyptic Christian movements in regards to attacks on Jews. And some of their books are very well known. So if you think there's a conspiracy of Jews, of gay people, of whatever, leprechauns, and you think time is running out, apocalyptic, and you consider yourself a hero for the society, for a time like this, you feel compelled to act out to stop the horror that you're witnessing. And that can be everything from attacks to murder. Now, there's a whole set of interesting ways in which this happens. It starts with what one scholar calls narratives of evil, narratives of fright, narratives of fear. They're conspiracy theories that say, the Jews are out to get us, the Muslims are out to get us, that wherever country you're in, the despised people are out to get us. And that then becomes the basis of the conspiracy theory, and that's the narrative of fear. The next thing is what is called basically scripted violence or stochastic terrorism, or a number of other terms that have been used. What it means is that if this narrative is in the mind of an individual or group, where does the narrative lead the hero? And basically the narrative says, if you know what's happening, you know who the villain is, you know what the outcome is. If you're a real usually a real man, now real hero in this narrative, you know that it's justifiable to stop what they're doing, and it may be justifiable to kill them, and it is sometimes justifiable to exterminate them. This has happened around the world for many, many centuries, and there's just now beginning to put together, looking at all of these sets of movements that were brought into being by this narrative. And there actually was a conference not long ago in Connecticut where this was brought up as one of the main themes of mass killings throughout history. And there have been mass killings throughout history. Some of them are even recorded in the Bible. So it's like, this is not new. What I think is new is our understanding of how mass communications ties into it with these narratives. So, and it has to do, obviously, with scapegoating and the heroic battle to cleanse the world of evil forces. So why are new fascist or the right, far right killing Jews now, and what is the current political environment? Well, the answer is very simple in terms of basic theory of political science and sociology. The neo-fascists and neo-Nazis and anti-Semites and white people smell the possibility of shifting the political environment through what is called exemplary violence. And exemplary violence is when it starts with exemplary dualism. They're not just bad. They're not just not like us. They're not just evil, but it's between us and them. It's a battle to the death. So that's exemplary dualism. And exemplary dualism leads to these acts of violence. And it's called exemplary violence. And exemplary violence then is written about by a wide range of people in the social science. And we certainly know the list, who are the targets. We don't have to repeat them. So why now? Well, white people and Christians and men and straight people are losing power and status in political, social, and cultural systems around the world. Some of us see that as justice. Some of us see it as a threat to our identity as people who have integrity and self-respect. I hope I belong in the first category. So if you look at the Charlottesville demonstration, the chant starts out, "You will not replace us," and very quickly becomes, "Jews will not replace us." Jews are the historic universal go-to scapegoats around the world. Great. The perfidy of Jews is frequently illustrated with images of Jews as vermin, rats, an octopus. These are collected by my colleague, Professor David Hirsch in London, and if you visit his website, I'd say, viewers beware. Some organizers on the political left continue to use these images in a variety of ways, all of which are unacceptable. They are to the political left what locusts are to a field of dreams. The far right is obviously not targeting really existing Jews. They're targeting a phantasm, a fictitious projection of Jews as a powerful force destroying the white race or the white Christian race, and apparently draining the precious bodily fluids of real men, which was explained in the movie Dr. Strangelove. Jew hatred is linked to a history of anti-Jewish bigotry within Christianity and is intertwined with Nordic legends of a white race. The narrative preceded the rise to power of the Nazi Party in Germany, as fans of Wagner can explain in stultifying detail. So the images that were used to build the Nazi movement came out of a broad base in the society of metaphors and images and ideas and music and what it meant to be a man, especially in a heroic context. The Center for Millennial Studies at Boston University looked at the relationship between Christian apocalyptic movements and murders, mass murders, whether they have the wrong kind of Christians or of Jews or of Muslims. And so apocalyptic events, the idea that something momentous is about to occur, is a real trigger for mass murder and has been for centuries. In terms of the changing dynamics of gender, I recommend the research on misogyny of PRA alum Alex DeBranco, who has just started the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, because male supremacism, anti-Semitism, white racial nationalism, these are all a complex that are often intricately interlocked. Now, just to make it even more horrible, if you look around the world, there are now, setting aside the fact that there was no such thing as an Aryan race and that Aryanism is a myth, that there is a sense of a white collective heritage and destiny, which is rooted in the stories of the Nazi Germany and rooted in the stories of the Aryans who allegedly came out of what is part of India, went on the diaspora and spread, if you read one best-selling feminist book, became the holders of the chalice, not a blade. One of the central feminist books written 20 years ago was basically an anti-Semitic white power paean written as a feminist study because the writer did not know that she was getting her information from an Aryanist white supremacist organization set up in Washington, D.C., and considered mainstream in political science and history inside the Beltway. Great. So if you look now at what's happening in India, in Russia, and the United States, and the linkage of racialism with religious integralism, all of this has the same root, and all of it has the same metaphor, which is that we are the chosen people, whether you're Hindu white people, or Russian white people, or Christian white people who claim to have made great strides in reaching out to people of color communities, and to an extent is true, but people of color do not hold the power in the Christian right. They just don't. So what we're talking about here then is seeing this linkage between race and religion and masculinism going on around the world, and yet it's very difficult to see, if for no other reason, because the language difficulties. And so what's happened is there's a group of us who've been sharing stuff among English-speaking scholars around the world looking at this. We never can talk in plain English, pan-Aryan religious integralist movements. Yeah. Anyways, there must be a better way. White supremacist nutcases. I'm sure someone will come up with a term. But that's what's happening all over the world now. And that's what Donald Trump is embedded in with the Christian right, and some of his supporters who are in the quote-unquote soft white nationalist movements. Now, we'll hear more, especially with our next speaker, about how soft that really is in terms of white nationalism spreading around through different vectors. Many folks in the U.S. Christian right also believe Trump is a modern-day King Cyrus. For those who didn't read the Old Testament, King Cyrus was, in ancient Persia, and freed the Jews from bondage. Now, Cyrus was kind of a jerk and a bully. Wait, Trump is kind of a jerk and a bully. And the metaphor is the same for the Christian right. King Cyrus and Donald Trump are troubled, they're depraved, they're flawed, but they're going to help us take the next step towards our liberation. For Jews, it was freedom from bondage. For the Christians, it's a move towards Jerusalem, where they intend to wreck the Muslim shrines on top of the Temple Mount, because that's Haram el-Sharif, build the third Temple of Solomon using blood from a steer being raised in Texas by Christian right guys, so they can slaughter the steer and dedicate the ground and rebuild the third Temple of Solomon on the Temple Mount, aka Haram el-Sharif. How many people think that that's going to just be a peaceful enterprise? Right, I don't see it. I think there might be some trouble there. But if you want to know how Trump pays back the Christian right and this very scary and, I think, frankly, racial religious kind of bond that he's formed with most of these people, it's basically, it doesn't end well. I don't know how else to say it. And for people who think the Christians are such a good friend to the Jews, please remember, I'm a Christian, I study the Bible, and in the end of the book of Revelation, Jews are rounded up and stuffed into a giant wine press like the grapes of wrath, as the man on the white horse arrives. And as they're squeezed to death by a vengeful God, their blood flows up to the knees of horses down the valley of Megiddo, thus Armageddon. The narrative of the Christian right ends with Jews, except for 144,000 who convert at the very last moment. The Jews are all murdered, okay? Now, what's the narrative? And I'm not saying this is connected directly. I'm saying it is a metaphor that is floating around now. It's the same metaphor of the far right. Jews will not replace us. In fact, it is open season on Jews because they are the enemy. And so this metaphor of who gets to live and who gets to die, based on both racial and nationalist and religious ideas of the coming apocalypse between good and evil, can lead to very, very bad outcomes. And you know, man on the white horse, wine press, grapes of wrath. This is embedded in the American psyche through our very study of in our schools. So I'm hearing voices. Trump is not a modern day Cyrus, but it doesn't matter. Okay, so on top of this, there is all over the world now among English, not just, but Christian evangelicals read a series of books called the Left Behind series, which in the United States in English alone sold 10 million copies. There are hundreds of millions of copies. I have a friend in Israel who wrote about this as one of the most disgusting anti-Semitic tropes ever published in book form. It is full of anti-Semitic references, as well as many other outlandish references, and all of it ends in a bloodbath. So hundreds of millions of copies of this have been circulated around the world. And it's such a problem that like 20 years ago when it was first coming out, I actually attended a giant international conference at a seminary outside of Boston where, people from Protestant, Jewish, Roman Catholic, Orthodox Catholic, from all over the world, these religious leaders came and said, how do we explain to our parishioners that this is like, it's not what we believe in. This is heresy. But you can't get up in front on Sunday and ask for the collection and say, oh, by the way, you're all heretics. So it became very difficult then for religious leaders to sort of intercede in their own congregations to deal with people who were talking about this mythical and horrific bloodbath vision, which had nothing to do with the actual religious beliefs of the denomination, whether it was Protestant or Roman Catholic or Orthodox Catholic or anything else. And there was no answer. In fact, it was very impossible except a one-on-one with parishioners saying, I don't think that's what we believe. No. So it's a problem. So I think that the U.S. Christian right is having both a politicized religious moment as well as a political religious moment. That's a difference. So that there's a politicized religious moment as well as a political religion in the sense of Vogelin. Now, I know most of you have never heard of Eric Vogelin. I had never heard of Eric Vogelin. Eric Vogelin, before Hannah Arendt, wrote the thesis about what happens when people become engaged in politics with the fervor of it being a religion. In other words, it's not when religion and politics merges. It's when people engage in political activism with the religious fervor of a spiritual belief, okay? And so Vogelin got forgotten. But then there was this group of people in the 90s who started putting out a journal called the Journal of Political Totalitarian Movements and Political Religions. And I got asked to be on that journal. I said, I don't know what they are. And they said, okay, that's okay, we're going to assign you studies. So they assigned me studies. And what I found out is that Vogelin was right all along, that throughout history and today, we are looking at political movements which are being energized by a belief among the members in those movements that they're on a mission. It's sort of like the Blues Brothers on smack. I mean, they're just totally obsessed with the idea that, they have this mission and they've got to complete it. Unfortunately, they don't think through where it's heading. So that's great. So time is running out. Okay. When time is running out, it begs the question, why wait? If they are about to get us, aren't we justified in first getting them? And once that starts to spread through a political movement, individuals, usually men, almost overwhelmingly men, say, well, if these people are evil and they're out to get us, and if we don't do something, they'll kill us, then I'll prove that I'm the man and go out and kill them first. And a lot of that is the demonstrative murder you see of Jews and others today among men who see themselves as heroes who need to act first, not just to avenge the collective, but to essentially remasculinize themselves, as if killing someone would do that. But hey, we'll just skip that. So I guess what I'm saying is that the narrative of Jews as not like us and a threat now transcends the apocalyptic Christian right, as well as the racist nationalist right, as well as a range of people who just seem to be more vaguely caught up in the idea that Jews are evil and a problem. So that's where we are now. I don't see the major human rights groups or even the major Jewish institutions playing out this in a theoretically valid and powerful way. We still hear a lot about hate and extremism. We don't hear a lot about the fact that there are political ideologies and religious ideologies that have been studied since Vogelin in the 30s, and with Hannah Arendt, and with dozens of others. Looking at what happened in Rwanda is a wealth of information about how this happens in a closed society. I think I will say that I have a few friends who work in some of these units, and certainly the new Center on Hate and Extremism. I know I don't like the words, but hey, he's a friend, and he's doing good work. At Bard, they're beginning to look at this with a much more theoretically powerful framework than just saying, extremists aren't like us. Well, extremists are like us, except they use different forms of violence. So I would say when you're tempted to use the word hate or extremism, see if you can come up with another paired language, murdering Jews, killing Muslims, stomping gay people. I mean, the pair is what matters, the affront and the target, the affront and the target. I was down at the Carter Center in Atlanta looking at Islamophobia, and people came from all over the world. And it was astounding how many of us came in with exactly the same message. We know how this works. It's been studied for decades. The problem is people don't hear about it in the mainstream media, and the mainstream institutions are reluctant to call it what it is. Well, it's genocide, it's race hate, it's anti-Jewish bigotry and murder. We know the terms that we should be using, but you don't hear them on network TV. You very seldom hear them anywhere among people who are quote-unquote respectable. So Vogelin's famous for well, he has a famous quote, I have to say this, goes, don't immonetize the eschaton. What does that mean? It's incomprehensible. But it basically is, don't try and build heaven on earth in the here and now, because it always ends badly. So what he's saying is, if your belief is this kind of supersonic idea of basically washing away all that is evil and enforcing all that is good and deriving that from the power of a God, it never ends well. So there you go. Nazis kill Jews because it is a transcendent political act, and in some cases, a religious duty. The far right is part of that movement. Stop trying to understand the logic of it, whether it's a political organization or just far-right individuals who are on a rampage, because it only becomes logical if you live inside the head of a neo-Nazi. And I got to tell you, I don't recommend that approach. Thank you. Come on up. So I have up here, while she's coming up here, I have a bunch of white roses for the White Rose Society. And if you haven't heard of the White Rose Society, do look it up online. I'll do a little I'll do a little magic trick later. You need a watch? Oh, he's going to introduce you. We've done so much rehearsing. Okay. All right. What? Bio. What bio? You think I have the bio? I do have the bio.
Talia Lavin is a freelance writer and researcher based in Brooklyn with bylines in GQ, The New Yorker. Sorry, should I restart that? Talia Lavin is a freelance writer and researcher based in Brooklyn with bylines in GQ, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and The New Republic. Her forthcoming book about the far right online, Culture Warlords, Dispatches from the Dark Web of White Supremacy, will be out on Hatchet Books in October 2020. Let's welcome Talia.
Hello. Thank you all for coming out. I have to note, I'm coming straight from my family's Purim Suda, our meal for Purim, and I went to Shul last night, and after a year of researching the far right, very immersively every day, I very lustily booed Haman this year. I think that it's a story, the Book of Esther is a story of the recurrence of genocidal logic, and that's why we boo each year. Let us add insult to injury. Let us hang him in the public square. Fuck fascism, fuck Nazis, across time and forever. And with that, no, I have, so 2 caveats. I'm speaking after what we might call a gadol, a giant of the field, and I've only been involved for a couple of years. And then the second thing is I have a panic disorder, sometimes get a little nervous speaking in public, so I'll do my best, bear with me. And I'm going to read, trying to figure out what to say today was like a minuscule process of editing my book, which is that I have trouble cutting down what I'm saying. But I'm gonna read a little bit from the introduction to my book, Cultural Warlords, and then a little bit from the very lengthy chapter on anti-Semitism. And I trust that Spencer will keep me from going too far over my time. So I'm just gonna read a little bit from the introduction, which sort of talks about the process of researching for the book. Every day for nearly a year, I immersed myself in chat groups and websites and forums where photos of lynchings were passed around like funny memes, where "Kill Jews" was a slogan and murderers were called saints. On the anniversary of the Pittsburgh shooting, I watched them celebrate Robert Bowers, the murderer of 11 Jews at prayer, like a hero and a friend. I listened to strangers talk about killing kikes every day. I listened to strangers incite violence and praise murder and talk about washing the world with blood to make it white and pure. I listened to their podcasts. I watched their videos. I listened to their atrocious rap battles and watched them plan to meet up and celebrate the racism that was their raison d'etre. Before I started writing, I was already the top Google search result for greasy fat kike, which is every girl's dream, thanks to the neo-Nazi website, The Daily Stormer. I had already had a hate group send my parents a postcard with the Nazi-era slogan, "Blood and Soil." I had already had my sister's names published on a white supremacist social media site used by the Pittsburgh shooter. I thought I was ready for what researching this book would do to me. I wasn't. As I write this now, I feel myself incandescent with the kind of anger that doesn't just last an evening. It's an old cliche that lovers shouldn't go to bed angry. Well, for the past year, I have gone to bed with my anger and woken up with my anger and gone about my day with my anger hot and wet in my mouth like blood. It's not that I discovered that members of the racist far right are inhuman or monsters beyond comprehension. They're not some entirely new species of being that requires forensic analysis and the dispassionate gaze of the scientist. They're not uniquely stupid or uniquely mired in poverty or uniquely beset by social problems or even members of any specific socioeconomic class. They're not monsters, they're people. Just people, mostly men and some women, all over this country and this world, who have chosen to hate, to base the meaning of their lives on hate, to base their communities of solidarity on hate, to cultivate their hate with tender, daily attention. They are just people, people with an entire alternate curriculum of history, who operate within an insular world of propaganda built to stoke rage and incite killings for no other purpose at all. There are rich men and poor men, tradesmen and office workers and teenagers and men cresting middle age. They eat and sleep and sometimes drink too much and sometimes are sober. They're lonely, some of them, horny, some of them, sometimes depressed, and sometimes confused, and sometimes joyful. They're people, just like you and me. They could work in the next cubicle over and you might not know it. Sit one seat over in class from you and you might not know it. Live in your neighborhood, play on your sports team, and you would never know that deep in the night they trade photos of lynchings like baseball cards and laugh. But I know them now, these men and women. I've seen what they write and how they talk and what they read and even how they sing, poorly. It is precisely their humanity that angers me so much. The hate they promulgate and the violence they desire are the culmination of dozens or hundreds of small human choices. They choose every day and every day more of them to create alternate identities that embrace the swastika and the skull mask and the Totenkopf, the worst of history and the worst of the present melding seamlessly. They choose to dream not of peace or equality or of anything better than the sorry, ragged world as it is, but of a worse world, riven by terror, awash in the blood of those they consider subhuman, which means anyone not white, which means anybody Jewish, which means anyone who fights back against their putrid cancer of an ideology. Their dialogue is unremittingly puerile and violent. Everything about them goes back again and again to violence as hummingbird does to nectar. It is what they crave. It fills them with a fleeting sense of virility and meaning. The fear they can instill makes them feel powerful. The murderers they celebrate are their brothers in arms. And I admit that as I researched this book and wrote it, the anger I felt calcified into a parallel hatred, one not based on skin color, but on the sheer accumulation of vitriol I consumed, and the way people I'd never met spoke about killing people that looked just like my nieces and nephews, my cousins and aunts, my lovers, my friends, and me. In a sense, I began to enjoy deceiving them, taking an acrid little pleasure in my own duplicity. But anger at these bigots was only part of what I felt. Some of my rage became directed at the people who opposed strong action against neo-Nazi and far-right organizing. I raged against white moderates, the people who don't believe in deplatforming Nazis from every perch they get or facing down their marches, depriving them of audience and influence and a safe perch from which to spread their bile. The people who say, ignore them, let them march, let them tweet, let them speak on campus, let them have their say, and they will be defeated in the marketplace of ideas. The people who bill themselves as reasonable, who say, let them air out their arguments. But the effect of these ideas when they are aired out is like Zyklon B. Studying them as deeply as I have has made me realize there is no amount of such rhetoric acceptable in the country's discourse, just as there is no acceptable amount of poisonous gas to let seep into the atmosphere of a bedroom. To assert otherwise is an argument born of self-congratulation, the argument that being tolerant of violent racism is just another form of tolerance, and not a capitulation to the far right's own view of their legitimacy. There is racism of many types, the milquetoast-seeming intellectual pablum of identitarianism, the straightforward violence of accelerationism. There is racism bound up in religious ideas, racism bound up in pseudoscience, and all of it is poison. And to allow any of it to be aired, particularly under the mealy-mouthed argument for tolerance, is to give way to a movement that seeks absolute power and the total destruction of its enemies, who are its enemies by virtue of the immutable characteristics of their birth. To make peace with white supremacy, to give it room, to tender it mercy, is to assert that protecting Black and brown and Muslim and gay and trans and Jewish people from violence isn't all that important or necessary. The marketplace of ideas breaks down when poison is sold in pretty packages, when hate is pressed into eager hands. Studying the far right taught me what hatred looks like, and taught me how to hate. Hatred makes me itch inside. It's like wearing a too small wool sweater over my soul. It doesn't come naturally to me, though anger does. It is painful to have your face pressed up for so long against the intellectual equivalent of aqua regia. I can feel my soul deformed, distended. It will hurt for a long time, but I know why I've done this, and it's hardly for money or fame. There are easier routes to both. It's for those children they want to kill, for my nieces and nephews, my cousins and aunts, my lovers, my friends, and me. My mind spun hellward for months, but I did these things to describe these people, the white supremacists and their culture and their motivations. To do so is to deprive them of the power to organize in total darkness, to operate as the terrifying boogeymen they would so like to be. It is to drag them by their hair into the light and let them scream. I will never forgive them for hating me and everyone I love as much as I do. I have friends who neo-Nazis have publicly fantasized about raping and flaying and murdering and leaving for dead, and I will never forget it. I will never forgive them for making me hate them as much as I do, for folding a red loathing into my soul. So I ask you to fight for a better world for you, for me, for all the black kids and Muslim kids and Jewish kids and trans kids and brown kids who deserve a world free of the verminous miasma of hatred. Let us hold it to the light, this wet, rotting, malodorous thing, and let it dry up and crumble into dust and be gone.
Conversation. But first, I have a small dedication involving the White Rose. How many of you know about the White Rose Society? A lot. If you don't, you should find out. They were a group of not Jewish, mostly Catholic college students who decided they were going to resist. And they got together on the balcony of a school, basically auditorium, front lounge, whatever. And they were going to pass out, very bad tactic, by the way, on a corner of a basically drop-off into the main auditorium, flyers that were going to be passed out secretly. And essentially what happened is that they basically dropped the flyers off the balcony down onto the floor, where they were picked up and handed over to the police, and then the White Rose Society was hunted down and murdered. But that's not the end of the story, because that would be a terrible way to end a story. You know, it's a horrible thing that happened to them. But the White Rose became the symbol of the anti-fascist resistance throughout Europe. And the White Rose became a symbol then around the world of resistance to tyranny. And the White Rose then became a metaphor for people who stood up and fought back. And we honor the memory of the White Rose today. We honor the memory of all those resist. And as you must know, the White Rose can never be destroyed. Thank you. Well, here we are.
Hello. I just want to tell you guys I had like 20 more pages and then was like, you know what, that's actually a good place to stop. So.
But what are some of the ideas? I'll be a straight person. So what else?
Well, I talk about what I did to monitor the far right. And basically, I spent a lot of time on an app called Telegram, which is an app that was founded in 2013 in Russia by a guy named Pavel Durov. It's a really important, it was a really important app for Russian dissidents. And when I was a fact checker at The New Yorker, I actually used it to communicate with clandestine sources a lot. However, it's been adopted in full force by the far right around the world and in the US in particular. So by the end of June 2019, I had joined about 90 far-right chats, and their names, a lot of them were explicitly anti-Semitic, and I have a list of some of their names here. They're really gross. It was stuff like, like a chat, they sort of had putatively different focuses, so like a chat for members of Generation Z was called Generation Zyklon. Oh, wow. There was like a whole series of linked channels called the Guild of Counter-Semitism. I actually still have like the Telegram app on my phone because I'm editing the book now. So I have these lovely channels being blasted into my head like Jesus warned us about them, the supremacy division, Operation Werewolf, the White World Union of National Socialists, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was kind of looking through these every day, which was truly fabulous for my mental health. And one thing that was interesting was that I watched a whole anti-Semitic meme be born, and kind of then fade out, but I watched like a whole cycle. There was this, it was inspired by a line in the manifesto of Dylan Roof, who was the man that shot 9 African-American men to death, church parishioners to death in Charleston in 2015, where he wrote that Jews were an enigma and that the chief problem with understanding the Jewish agenda was the success with which Jews had assimilated into whiteness. And he said, if we could somehow turn every Jew blue for 24 hours, I think there would be a mass awakening because people would be able to see plainly what was going on. And so in November 2019, a small channel started photoshopping images of Jews and turning them blue. And so it was opinion columnists, Supreme Court judges, tech executives, presidential advisors, all painted in various shades of blue. And I watched this spread throughout a network of linked white supremacist channels, make its way onto Twitter, make its way onto Facebook. And it was like it was like how in a lab you use a stain to keep track of a particular cell. It was like that. And it was sort of fascinating and terrifying experience watching this happen. And several of my friends who are journalists and not Jews were painted blue in these images as well. So yeah, I guess that's, I don't know, one thing, but ask me some more questions, I'll...
Well, it's always, I mean, all of it, and there's a bunch of people I know in this audience who have done I won't call it counter-espionage, who've done serious scholarly research into these movements using a variety of mechanisms, many of which won't be named here. And we all suffer the same kind of horrendous sense that we're far too close to what we're watching, and also the sense that these are just people. And it's that dichotomy. They're just people. You have normal lives, except they want to kill you. And that's very hard to deal with and remain kind of balanced, don't you think?
Oh yeah, it's terrifying. Like, I would just wake up in the middle of the night and like, look at my phone reflexively, and what's on my phone is like, gas the kikes. I'm like, oh geez, how am I gonna get back to sleep?
Right.
And then, but it's these same people that are talking about, my boss, my day job, my kids, my wife.
Kid's sick, right, yeah.
Like, I think there's this really dangerous sense that like, people desperately want white supremacists to be a guy named Cletus slobbering in his mother's basement, no one you've ever met, like no one you'll ever know, or they want Nazis to be the Nazis from the Indiana Jones movies who like show up in SS uniforms and like are basically exist to be punched in the face. And like the truth is these are morally complex people, and as you put really eloquently, like their motivations for joining this movement are not that dissimilar to why someone would become a socialist or even join like the Joe Biden campaign. It's like to be part of something bigger than themselves. They feel lonely, they feel lost, they're atomized, and they watch one YouTube video that leads to another, and maybe they find someone in the comments that's recommending a channel, or they're on Twitter and they find someone else talking about these ideas, and that's how these movements grow. It's not alien. It's not like, it's so scary, and I hate being the messenger of this, but like, it's not a dumbass named Cletus. A lot of these people are very stupid, but a lot of everyone is very stupid. Like, they're not uniquely stupid, and they're not uniquely poor, and they're not uniquely anything. It could be anyone, just probably white.
Yeah.
You know?
That's the entry card.
Yeah.
You're white.
Yeah. Well, a lot of these groups to join like the sort of more serious radical Telegram groups will make you post a picture of your foot or your hand next to like a racist text to show that you're white enough to join. Or your nose to show you're not a Jew. There are Jews with small noses. So, but yeah, it's like post a picture of your hand. That's like a pretty classic test. Oh my God. I don't know, I get kind of swarthy, so. But there are ways around it. Anyway.
But there's a burden. That's a heavy load you took on.
Well, yeah. I mean, the weirdest part was like, because I have like a lot of followers on Twitter. I don't really I'm not like a frontline anti-fascist. I sometimes write op-eds. It's not like I'm like some super serious, like, operative that is a real threat to white supremacist organizing. But I had this insane experience, and it actually is like the first part of chapter 1, so you can tell this is gonna be like a super cheerful book. But I logged into a chat that I'd been monitoring, and I found, it was like 4 o'clock in the morning in mid-June 2019, and I logged into the chat, and I found a discussion about whether I was too ugly to rape.
Oh.
For the previous hour or so, members of that chat had been casually discussing sex with Jewish women. I condone and endorse consensual relations with yentas, one wrote. Yenta is a Jewish word for busybody that has been co-opted by some white supremacists as a slur for Jewish women writ large. But not breeding, wrote another. 1 minute later, a user asked, would anyone rape Talia Lavin? I'd rape her with my double barrel, responded a user who went by James Mason, in homage to an American neo-Nazi and child pornographer most famous for Siege, a book in which he advocates for racist terrorism. Most users found me too ugly to rape. Her appearance makes me viscerally ill. I can smell her through the monitor. She would make me want to throw up my intestines. And the conversation ended with an oblique expression of a desire to kill me. No need to go into detail here, wrote one user about threats of violence. Like anyone is ever going to think, gee, I'm glad we kept Talia Lavin with us, responded another. So that was what reading this book was researching this book was like. It was like insane. Like sometimes I would dip into these like accelerationist neo-Nazi channels and they'd be talking about moi, of all the subjects in the world, simply because I'm a Jew and I'm an anti-fascist, and I sometimes say on Twitter that I don't like Nazis. The point is there's a price to saying these things in public. There's a price to being a Jew. There's a price to being a woman who says these things in public.
I think that's been really different for all of the white men I've worked with who do this kind of work, is that they don't have that experience. I mean, it's very common to have someone on the other side say, I'd like to kill you. But those other fantasies aren't there. They don't obviously talk about sexual stuff because they're too hung up on that. But it's basically, there's a kind of a carte blanche entry card into doing anti-fascist work if you're a white man. And I think that that's not been explored, at least publicly, by those of us who do it enough. But I know that I could be at a supermarket in Chicago and one of the Nazis I was organizing against would walk by and he'd go, hi, Chip. And I felt morally compelled by the upper middle class white upbringing to say, hi, Joe. And then I'd feel bad, but so what? I mean, because I had that privilege. It was privilege that it didn't matter that I didn't ask for it. I just had it. It was part of the package. And I think that it's amazing you've done this research, just to say. It's amazing you've done this research. And I hope you have friends and allies and comrades who can help you deal with the emotional stuff, because even I had to talk to people about the emotional stuff of, sitting through a Nazi meeting or stuff like that.
Well, if everyone could give a round of applause to my parents, who are in the third row, and
Yeah.
have dealt with like a lot of me showing up on their couch being like, I can't handle this. But I would say this. I have a friend who's like a pretty prominent anti-fascist and who said like a lot of fascists look at me as sort of the Joker to their Batman. That it's this sort of relationship of equals and opposites. If you're a woman, that doesn't exist.
Right.
I'm like a mouthy feminist, and they simply categorically believe I shouldn't exist.
Right.
And it's not even just because I'm a Jew. I think there are Jewish men that they can like view with grudging respect. It's, the contemporary far right, the alt-right and its spin-offs, have surprised even earlier generations of neo-Nazis with the virulence of their anti-feminism. And that comes from internet culture, from the world of gaming, from these sort of gender-segregated spaces online. But anti-feminism is a huge entree into the white supremacist movement. Sexual entitlement is a huge entree into the white supremacist movement. All of this anti-feminist stuff where you attack women for being too loud is really great training for attacking Jews for being Jews, and attacking, Black and Muslim and trans and gay people for being Black and Muslim and trans and gay people. And it's even better, it's a double bonus of the mouthy feminist you're attacking is a dirty Jew. So I've definitely experienced, literally like last week, someone posed as me on the neo-Nazi swarming message board 4chan, found a bikini picture I had posted 4 years ago, briefly, then taken down, but not before someone posted it to Reddit. Anyway, posed as me, pretended I had accidentally put up this bikini picture on 4chan, and then the Daily Stormer, the neo-Nazi sort of broadsheet on the internet, wrote a 9,000-word screed about me, the bulbous Jew, Jewish sexual degeneracy, and a very elaborate theory that I get off on being sexually humiliated by Nazis.
I'm sure
I was
you
just like
do,
in,
yeah.
I've never posted to 4chan. I was like, in my apartment in Brooklyn at the time, it was very surreal, and I haven't even published my book yet, so
Right.
just you wait.
How about some questions? I understand that, are there people who run around and help with this, or are we out of luck? I see someone running down the stairs. I think there's they have a plan.
Everyone, thanks for being here. If you have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand. We'll come over and bring the mic to you.
I often wonder why the second largest massacre of Jews was never really discussed in history. That's the First and Second Roman Wars, where 1.4 million Jews were killed, according to Tacitus and Josephus. Was that anti-Semitism, or was that the root of it, or was that something entirely different? Because the Zealots attacked the Roman baggage train, which caused a reaction, and then you had the First and Second Wars, and a lot of people were crucified. Is there anything in that example of the second largest Jewish massacre that has any roots related to what you call anti-Semitism today?
I can take this one.
Wow, by all means.
Ish. No. The stuff we call modern anti-Semitism has its roots in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's largely a 20th century invention. Prior to that, you had Christian bias against Jews and these latent innate Christian anti-Jewish biases that come from the texts of Christianity and then were inflated by the medieval church. I can't speak to the ancient Romans. I stick more to contemporary internet stuff and went about as far back as 1500 for my research, so apologies.
Genocides go way back. There are all kinds of genocides. And I think that we tend to not understand the linkages, especially in the Middle East, of various groups of people moving in and over each other and around each other and setting up. I just finished reading a wonderful story about the Philistines and who they really were, because we mostly know about the Philistines from one point of view. Well, now, anthropologists and others are sort of saying, wait a minute, these are real people. They weren't, just jerks. And I guess I'm going to end up where you are, which is that at some point, this kind of universal distaste for the other, which you could find anywhere in the world, began to meld around the theories of scientific racism and phrenology, and then the really cockamamie idea that there was an Aryan race, and you know, there was an Aryan language that went all over the place. So I think it sort of was in a potboiler for a while, and then emerged sort of around the same time in the late 1800s.
Yeah. Anyone got any questions later than ancient Rome?
No, Chip, you were talking about before about talking about people approaching politics as religion, and I can understand how that can turn into fanaticism. That God said it, I believe it, that settles it.
No, that's not what Vogelin. I'm sorry, this is so tough. Vogelin was saying not that people adopted a religious view at all. It's that they practiced their politics with the same fervor as if it were a mandate from God. But it's not at all a religion.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens. There are religious people who are Jews.
I mean, I think people in the civil rights movement, were practicing their politics like it was a mandate from God. I mean, maybe for people like the Freedom Riders, it was more like courting martyrdom than it was God told me to kill these people because they're evil. But still, like the civil rights movement was, a lot of it was very religious, especially the people who were, out there risking death, like the Freedom Riders.
Right, I totally agree with you, and I'm a practicing Christian. As I say, I'm going to keep practicing until I get it right. The civil rights movement had all sorts of religious folks involved in it, and also non-religious folk. Also a lot of commies who get written out pretty, blithely. But it's what Hannah Arendt pulls the concepts of totalitarianism out of the work of Vogelin, and others have said that essentially this is when a group of people become essentially fanaticized. And Vogelin was explaining it one way, and Arendt explains it another, and there's a lot of explanations. There's some new research, very good. There's actually a page on lone wolf terrorism on Wikipedia that 10 minutes ago was pretty good and looks at all of these things. But it's basically understanding that people don't need an organized religion to develop an apocalyptic fanatic view of the other.
Hi. Chip, I wondered if you could speak to the scale of different parts of the far right, because you have studied militias and white supremacist groups that aren't neo-Nazis, and I mean, like there are all these different ins and outs that you've spent decades paying attention to as they erupt and subside and erupt again, and the relative size of the different pieces, like the neo-Nazis are kind of visible and capture the imagination. I'm really unclear about the size of them compared to some of the other segments of the far right that are operating
I'll ask her
now.
what she thinks of the size of the groups she's studying is.
So I tallied up all the numbers of the various channels I joined. It was around 40,000 people. Of course, there was a lot of overlap. There was a study specifically of Telegram by Vice News journalist Tess Owen that kind of said that Telegram was growing exponentially as a channel for the far right. That 150 channels with kind of an average of 1,000 members were created in 2019 alone. And so it's big. It's not huge, but it's like, somewhere between 150 to 200,000 people engaging in this kind of rhetoric online, and more who are watching it and passively consuming this kind of content. And of course, a very small fraction of those will go on to commit acts of violence, but you don't really need more than a few people with AK-47s to wreak a lot of damage.
if you look at some of the, that's ugly, thank you. If you look at the Christian right, I mean, the easiest way to count the Christian right as a voting force is it's about 15, somewhere between 12 and 18% of the voting public in every major election identifies itself when asked as part of the, or as feeling comfortable with the Christian right. And that's, what, millions and millions and millions of people. So somewhere between the 10 or 15 or so million people who are consolidated in various forms of the Christian right and other right-wing organizations, down to the people who are armed neo-Nazis, which is a relatively small group, but I'm assuming in the tens of thousands. You think that's a safe bet? I mean, it's a range. I think what the problem is that they have this leverage on the current political system, in part because the apocalyptic Christian evangelical movement. Remember, the people who support Trump think he's going to bring Jews to Israel, to take over the Temple Mount, to rebuild the third Temple of Solomon, and then, it'll all come down and be fulfilled. And Jews will take over the world because that's God's plan. Now, this is as nutty as Christians doing the same thing, and Muslims who think, the third, we're all the Abrahamic faith, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, so that we're all the children of Abraham. We all claim that piece of property, which is sometimes called Haram el-Sharif or the Temple Mount. And that, whoever owns it, if somebody tries to take it away, there's going to be like a huge war. And so this is what Trump's support for the Christian right is partly made of, and it's partly made from the conservative social positions against women's rights, against gay rights, against trans rights, against the rights of immigrants and Muslims. And it's a marriage of convenience between Jews and Christians supporting Trump, because the Christians who support Trump and the Jews that support Trump have a very different idea of where it all ends.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a lot of Jews who are okay with Christian Zionism simply because they don't believe the end of days are going to come to pass.
Yeah, right.
And
right.
so it's kind of like, well, it is a marriage of convenience. It's nice to have powerful allies, and you just don't look too closely at their motivations.
Right. And just in case you don't know, in the book of Revelation, it says that when Christ comes back, remember, all but 144,000 Jews are put in that wine press and killed, and then they all convert.
Yeah, it's the erasure of Judaism.
It's the erasure. There will be no Jews left.
Yeah.
Right, they're gone.
Yeah.
So that's just, I want to remind people of that. I know I've already mentioned it, but it's like, this is the motivation of tens of thousands of Christian rights activists.
It's bananas that you sound gimlet-eyed and crazy when you talk about this as like a significant driving force in U.S. geopolitics, but like it's absolutely true.
Right, I've been in rooms full of Christian right activists posing as myself, the Christian activist, different kind, where they talk about this, or they'll have, at dinner, their conversations, my friend Betsy, she's a Jew, oh, she's not one of the ones that gets killed. I mean, this is insane. Hey, what question?
I'm terrified of Christians, I don't know.
Chip, I was with you at a conference about 15 years ago on Jews and the left, or anti-Semitism and the left, excuse me.
Right.
And I think I wonder if you agree with me that a problem that the left has in dealing with anti-Semitism is that they look around Jews as a group in America and they say, this is not an oppressed group. And I think basically Jews are not oppressed until they're oppressed, till there's an occasion when they're oppressed. And which speaks to the real problem of anti-Semitism, which is that Jews are a vulnerable minority group. And when you look around the world, it's shocking how small a minority group you're talking about. This is a group that still hasn't fully recovered from the Holocaust, when 1/3 of the entire number of Jews in the world were murdered. So you still have probably fewer than 18 million Jews around the world. That, to me, is the real problem of anti-Semitism, that Jews are really vulnerable.
Well, of course, as a blanket statement, that Jews are and always have been vulnerable is the problem. But if you're looking at ideological issues on the left, I mean, you know, there are all sorts of, there's a huge variety of left positions at what it means to be a Jew and whether Jews can be, you know, allies in Israel and Palestine, and it's a complete mess. And I think that it's important to recognize that anyone who's the target of systematic oppression, the left should be supporting in some way, even if it's critically in some ways. But you got to remember that Jews are acceptable into mainstream America as a kind of a revocable privilege. I mean, I think too many Jews think they're part of mainstream America now, when I think that, you know, in troubled times that would be revoked by many Christians and others who just are easy to be shifted into blaming some other. And it's so easy to blame Jews. It's like the historical tour de force, you know. Oh, let's blame the Jews. So I think it's very complicated. I don't think I agree with you. I think that I battle very often in different forums with lefties and academic lefties about this question, and I just feel unsatisfied that it's been resolved in a good way. I don't know if that's it. I say it has not been resolved in a good way, and that leaves me unsatisfied.
Hey, wanted to ask you about something that was raised by the guy who introduced you, which was, you know, this issue, this issue of miscegenation, you know, and the killings because of them. And it sort of put me in mind of Christian identity and British Israelism. And I guess the question I have is, I know, you know, I used to sort of study this stuff, but 20 years ago, when those were really apparent religions with compounds. I'm wondering if that still exists, and then sort of the follow-up to that is, you know, where is the protocols and maybe some other stuff that seems to be more out there tell part of the story? The Christian identity narrative seems to tell the whole story about the Jews. You know, the role that they have in, you know, equality, why the mud people are being, you know, used by the Jews, and they become...
Could we separate the theology of Christian Israelism from what you're saying as being now turning towards a fact-based argument? Because it's not. It's a... Okay, I just wanted to be sure.
No. I mean, I guess what I'm sort of asking about is, to what degree is that narrative really one that's playing a role?
I mean, it's a small role, but it's, I mean, have you run across Christian identity on the online stuff? Because it's still around, but it's not the main trend.
I would say the Christian identity movement, which was for everyone who isn't like that, doesn't think about this stuff a ton. It was like an American religion that basically existed as a form of religious anti-Semitism. It was like Christian, but its entire purpose and raison d'etre was to blame Jews for everything wrong with the world. Lots more in there, but in essence, Christian identity has been sort of subsumed into contemporary white supremacist ideology. One of the things that I really observed was that, you know, people who are online in this way and obsessively hate-mongering in this way online are trading texts. They are reading the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They are reading Siege by James Mason. They are reading Brenton Tarrant's Manifesto. They are reading and absorbing and remixing older texts. So older theories of hate don't go away. And this idea that Jews are, and the way that white supremacists think about Jews now, there is like a very widespread theory that Jews are essentially deliberately seeking to dilute and destroy the white race via immigration, which is what that whole Jews will not replace us thing really meant, via sort of Jewish media encouraging race mixing and Jewish leftists encouraging immigration. The idea is to destroy the white race and create a more compliant and stupid sort of like super citizen, or like, citizen, a compliant citizen who is robotic and subject to Jewish perfidy because they have impure and terrible non-white blood. So, like I said, you sound gimlet-eyed and crazy when you talk about this, but that's what they're saying.
That is what they're saying.
That's what they're saying about us. It's bananas. So
It is bananas.
the point, to answer your question, yes, that old stuff is being used every day.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's about all we have time for. It is Purim after all, so we invite you all to join us for a l'chaim out in the hall, despite the unfortunate, not cheerful nature of today's presentation.
Cheerful?
Oh, sorry. Well,
But
Sorry,
thank
we
you
tried
very
to be
much to our
tried to be happy.
speakers today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
That was great.
oh, yeah, you were amazing too. What an honor.
Thank you. Can I steal your water before I finish?
Oh, please, yeah.
I'd like-
Oh my God.